On May 11, 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi landed at Marsala on Sicily's western coast with approximately 1,089 volunteers, known as the Expedition of the Thousand, Spedizione del Mille. Most of the volunteers were civilians from northern Italy. They were not professional soldiers, but they supported the movement to unite the Italian peninsula under a single national government. Garibaldi's objective was to overthrow Bourbon rule in Sicily and then continue into southern Italy. 4 days after landing, Garibaldi's force met Bourbon troops near Calatafimi. Although outnumbered, Garibaldi's volunteers forced the Bourbon army to retreat. The battle was relatively small in military terms, but its political impact was enormous. Many Sicilians who had remained neutral now believed Bourbon rule could be defeated. Local volunteers began joining Garibaldi's army. On May 27th, Garibaldi entered Palermo. Heavy street fighting continued for nearly a week. Barricades were built throughout the city. Civilians joined the fight alongside Garibaldi's volunteers. On June 6, 1860, Bourbon forces agreed to evacuate Palermo. Control of Sicily's largest city passed to Garibaldi. The Bourbon government had effectively lost control of western Sicily, as Bourbon officials abandoned towns across Sicily. Local government collapsed in many rural districts. For many villages, there was no functioning government for weeks or months. This administrative vacuum became one of the most important developments in Mafia history. Without an effective state, local landowners needed protection for estates, livestock, harvests, transportation routes. Many turned to influential local intermediaries who already possessed armed followers. These men could recover stolen property, collect debts, protect shipments, enforce agreements. Their authority increasingly came from personal influence rather than government appointment. On October 21, 1860, Sicily voted in a plebiscite on whether to join the Kingdom of Sardinia under Victor Emmanuel II. The official results showed overwhelming support for annexation. Although historians have debated how free and competitive the vote truly was, Sicily formally became part of the movement that would create the Kingdom of Italy. On March 7, 1861, the Kingdom of Italy was officially proclaimed. Victor Emmanuel II became the first king of a unified Italy. For many Sicilians, however, daily life changed with very little. The new government ruled from Turin and later Florence before eventually moving the capital to Rome. Like Naples before it, the national government remained geographically and politically distant from many Sicilian communities. The Italian government inherited significant problems in Sicily. Limited police presence, weak judicial institutions, high rural poverty, widespread illiteracy, poor transportation infrastructure, large agricultural estates controlled by relatively few landowners. Officials lacked the manpower to enforce laws consistently throughout the countryside. As a result, many communities continued relying on private protection. Between 1861 and 1865, local protection groups became increasingly organized in western Sicily, particularly around Palermo, Monreale, Bagheria, Corleone, Pornico. These organizations were not yet nationwide criminal syndicates. They consisted of independent local groups, often called a Cosche. A Cosca usually controlled a specific town, neighborhood, or rural district. Its influence depended on family alliances, economic relationships, and political connections, and the ability to use or threaten violence. There was no national mafia leadership. Each group operated independently. By the mid-1860s, private protection had become profitable. Landowners paid influential local figures to guard their estates. Merchants paid for safe transportation of their goods. Farmers sometimes paid to prevent theft rather than recover stolen property afterward. This created a system in which protection itself became a commodity. Historians generally identify this transition from informal influence to organized protection as one of the defining stages in the emergence of the Sicilian Mafia. By 1865, government officials and journalists had become using the word mafia in reports discussing criminal influence around Palermo. The exact origin of the word remains disputed. Between 1860 and 1865, Sicily experienced three major transformations: the collapse of the Bourbon rule, Italian unification, the emergence of organized local protection groups that evolved into the Sicilian Mafia. The Mafia did not appear overnight. It developed during a period when government institutions were weak, private protection became profitable, and local leaders accumulated power by filling the gaps left by the state. These conditions would continue shaping Sicily for decades. The next major step would come when the Mafia expanded beyond protecting landowners and began influencing politics, commerce, and municipal government. By 1865, Italian government officials were reporting that organized criminal groups exercised significant influence in parts of western Sicily, particularly around Palermo. These groups were not unified under a central leadership but operated as independent Cosche that controlled specific neighborhoods, villages, or rural districts, dependent on local influence rather than formal government power. By the 1860s, citrus exports had become one of Sicily's most profitable industries. Demand from Britain and the U.S. increased dramatically because citrus fruit helped prevent scurvy during long sea voyages. Protecting citrus groves, irrigation systems, warehouses, and transportation routes became highly profitable. Large estate owners frequently hired private guards instead of relying on government police. Protection extended beyond guarding orchards. Groups also escorted shipments to Palermo's ports, recovered stolen livestock, collected debts, settled commercial disputes, intimidated competitors. Protection gradually evolved into a business. In many areas, refusing protection could itself become dangerous. The basic mafia unit became known as a Cosche. A Cosche generally controlled one village, one neighborhood, one rural district. Leadership usually rested with the respected local figures who maintained influence through family relationships, business connections, political contacts, violence, or the threat of violence. The Cosche frequently cooperated but remained largely independent during this period. There was no island-wide governing body. In September 1866, Palermo experienced a major anti-government uprising known as the 7.5 Days Revolt. Rebels opposing taxation, military conscription, authority of the new Italian government. The Italian army eventually suppressed the rebellion. The revolt demonstrated that the government still struggled to maintain control over Sicily only 5 years after unification. It also reinforced the value of the local power brokers who could influence events independently of the state. Following the revolt, Italian officials began paying greater attention to organized criminal influence. Police reports increasingly described groups that controlled neighborhoods, influenced elections, protect fugitives, interfered with investigations, collecting illegal payments. Although terminology varied, officials increasingly referred to these organizations as the Mafia. By the late 1860s, Mafia groups had expanded beyond rural protection. They developed relationships with municipal officials, landowners, tax collectors, business owners, local politicians. These relationships benefited both sides. Politicians gained votes and neighborhood influence. Mafia leaders gained protection from investigation and access to government contracts. This pattern would continue for decades. During this period, investigators observed a widespread reluctance among witnesses to cooperate with authorities. Fear of retaliation discouraged many victims from reporting crimes. Others preferred resolving disputes privately rather than involving police. Although the formal concept of omerta would become more clearly defined later, many of its underlying practices were already evident. Silence became one of the organization's best protection. By 1874, the Italian government launched broader investigations into organized crime in Sicily. Officials collected testimony from police officers, judges, landowners, merchants, and local administrators. Investigators concluded that the Mafia influence extended well beyond isolated criminal acts. It had become part of the political and economic structure of parts of western Sicily. In 1875, politicians and scholars Leopoldo Franchetti and Sidney Sonnino traveled throughout Sicily to study the island's conditions. They interviewed government officials, farmers, business owners, police, local residents. Their research was later published as La Sicilia nel 1876, one of the earliest and most influential studies of Sicilian society. Franchetti described the Mafia not as a secret society controlling all of Sicily, but as a system of private power that flourished where state authority was weak. His work remains one of the foundational historical sources for understanding the early Mafia.